So, for centuries, Christians have been taught this idea that hell is a place of endless fiery torment where God inflicts his infinite wrath on finite sinners. And this idea can be found in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, as well as Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But what if I told you that that's not actually how hell works at all? In fact, there's actually a much better alternative that fits way better with God's love, God's justice, as well as even the Bible itself. Well, stick with me today because we're about to unlearn everything that you've been taught about hell. For most of church history, the dominant view has been infernalism, which is the idea that either one, sinners will be subject to God's infinite wrath, and then there's two, which is the idea that the doors of hell are locked from the inside, as C.S. Lewis once famously said. But this traditional view raises huge theological problems that seem almost impossible to reconcile with a God of love. The first problem is what I call IPFS, or infinite punishment, finite sins. And this is the idea that a sinner who has sinned for about 80 years within the course of their life is subject to God's infinite wrath. So let's use an analogy. Imagine that a chimpanzee violently attacks and kills the President of the United States. Instead of putting it under in a quick and painless death, what if we just said, no, we should torture it in the most unimaginable way possible and then kill it? Would that seem fair to the chimpanzee? Well, no, because the chimpanzee has no idea what it's doing. Similarly, for us, we're finite beings. We can't possibly understand what we're doing when we sin against an infinite God, so why should we deserve such infinite punishment? And the second problem is the incompatibility with the defeat condition. Now, the defeat condition is roughly the idea that God will ensure to each and every individual that he will defeat their suffering, or they will look back on their life and say that it was worth it. Now, these two problems are, in my opinion, probably the most potent against the traditional view of hell. But what if I told you that there's actually an alternative that can solve both of these problems? This is what's called the divine presence model. Now, the divine presence model is roughly the idea that sinners, instead of being cast out of God's presence, are actually fully in God's presence. Instead, they're just experiencing it in a way that they picture as unbearable. Unlike the saints who are experiencing God's love as joy, bliss, the damned are experiencing God's presence as utter torment, and it seems to them as if it's wrath. Imagine that you and your friend are at a concert, and you love the musician and you love his music. Your friend, on the other hand, hates this musician and hates his music. When you both are hearing the music, you're hearing the same music and you're loving it. However, your friend sees it as complete torment. They can't stand listening to it because they hate the musician and they hate his music. So instead of God actively punishing sinners, instead, the pain that comes from hell is when people are actively resisting God. So, under this model, nobody truly experiences irredeemable suffering. Everybody is able to look back on their life and say that it was worth it, even those who are in hell. Now, I know this is a controversial idea. However, I do believe it's also the best way to reconcile this with the defeat condition, because if somebody's experiencing unimaginable pains in hell, then that can't be promoting their good. However, if they're still able to experience some form of natural goods in hell, then at least their suffering could be defeated if they went through any. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to distinguish between two types of sin. On the one hand, we have active sin, and the other we have passive sin. Now, the reason why this is important is because there are also two types of pains that come from hell, which is the pain of sense and the pain of loss. So, whenever a sinner is committing or trying to commit active sin in hell, well, God's not going to let them, because under this model of hell, God has defeated all sin and all evil. So nobody can commit active sin in hell. So this is going to cause some kind of pain for the damned because they're not able to sin. So this would be the pain of sense. On the other hand, we have the pain of loss. So the pain of loss comes whenever a sinner has stopped trying to sin in hell and instead it just becomes more like passive sin, which is not loving God because that is a form of passive sin, but they're not actively in rebellion against God. Instead, they have accepted his sovereignty in hell and now live peacefully within his kingdom. I think this would imply some sort of limbo state where the damned are able to experience some form of natural goods, not supernatural goods, but because they have stopped trying to sin against God actively, they are now able to experience some form of natural goods that might come from this limbo state. However, this brings us to another idea, which is the idea that there are some who have gone through suffering so bad that not even natural goods can defeat it. Only supernatural goods can defeat it. So these kinds of people will not end up being in hell at all, not even in limbo. Um, in fact, I think that they will either be one, more receptive to God's grace, or two, God will give them more graces because he understands what they've gone through and he understands that, okay, no form of natural goods can defeat their suffering, so I am going to have to step in. Now, I know we covered a lot in this video. However, if you want to check out some of the biblical support for the divine presence model, I would recommend the appendix to Arzak Manis's book, Sinners in the Presence of a Loving God. So does this model make a little bit more sense than the traditional form? Let me know in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you want more deep dives into theology, philosophy, and biblical studies, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell.